Fair trade has come to have very different meanings. We argue that fair trade organizations have been clustering in some critical ways that in the long run may be running in totally different directions. Different groupings of fair trade initiatives may be building different development trajectories, which could have important long-term impacts for groups, organizations, farmers, and participants in the fair trade movement. What fair trade means in this historical sense will impact the development of the ecology, gender relations, racial relations, and global peace.
We ask, how is it possible that fair trade initiatives may be diverging and forming parts of larger social historical trajectories that are producing very different social outcomes? Is one fair trade cluster forming part of relations that reinforces hierarchy and short-term investments that borrow on the future, intensifying the gap between those without and those with cumulative unfair advantage? And is the other fair trade constellation working to bring comprehensive social, ecological, and work-based change through democratic engagement that facilitates the voluntary redistribution of wealth?
To facilitate social change, including change related to fair trade, it's critical to ask useful questions that will generate new knowledge that reveals how and to what extent fair trade and other social change projects are changing the world in long-term, systemic manners which turn human relationships away from global inequality and environmental degradation and sets people on a new path of long-term alternative development. A unidisciplinary approach pulls question formation and knowledge together from all related areas and places them under a holistic, constantly evolving theoretical framework. Important education and research-related questions include the investigation of how social change projects, and in this case, how fair trade initiatives, are unfolding within historical global society while evolving global transitions that may bring a better world. Asking penetrating, revealing questions is some of the most important work done by all thinkers, whether they be engaged and active learners, social change agents, teachers, students, researchers, alternative business people, government agents, all who are trying to make a difference.
As social scientist Ram Krishna Mukherjee asked, what will it be? This is one of the least posed but most critical social change questions for universities and other social change organizations, whether they are cooperatives, NGOs, or other nonprofits, governments, or businesses. Here we ask, what will it be for fair trade? Where is it going? And will fair trade be able to continue advancing gender, racial, and global equality within the context of sustainable ecological development? In this paper, we also ask, what are the general characteristics of the two main clusters of fair trade organizations, which we characterize as the volume-focused grouping and the comprehensive change grouping, and how do they compare and contrast? What does this mean for fair trade education in universities and other community-based groups and global organizations?
In the 1980s and 1990s, cooperatives and nonprofits in the South and the North defined the basic principles, ethics, and democratic ways to enact a new kind of production, trade, and cultural relationships. They saw fair trade as a global movement for long-term social change. The fair trade movement calls on people everywhere to work together in a global project of eradicating poverty, developing organic and sustainable food systems, establishing equality for gender and racial global groups, and creating transitional and supportive relationships of friendships that both return control over production to small producers and their democratic cooperatives in the global South, and two, re-involve people in the global North in their own self-sufficient practices, which help end imperialist exploitation of natural and human resources in the global South.
As the fair trade landscape is surveyed today, it seems that fair trade organizations generally have become divided into two general groupings. First, there are those with a narrower, volume-focused, large-scale business outlook that attenuate cash deficits for various farmers on a seasonal basis as they respond to the fluctuations of interbusiness competition. The high volume model has a general characteristic that it needs to work within the existing supply chain, which continues to operate within a core-centered economic system. Basically, this is a reform model that is shallow and easily adaptable within the existing commodity system. This is a type of reform that goes from being very weak to possibly being somewhat beneficial. If reform does not give access to small farmers, it is a very weak model and offers little chance of generating any kind of long-term, real, sustainable change.
The other form are fair trade organizations with a broad, comprehensive, and deep development outlook that facilitate a long-term structural transition towards a more egalitarian, ecological world. One could say that there is a continuum of fair traders, going from those who use traditional corporations and plantations to generate high volumes of coffee and other products. That has been accepted by many certifying organizations as fair trade. That's on one side. And the other side is those who seek comprehensive, long-term change by replacing undemocratic, unequal work relations with new, ecological, gender-inclusive organizations that institute structural change at the local level, with the assistance of other mission-driven fair trade organizations. These two models have come to represent very different practices and ideas about what fair trade is. The deep, comprehensive model of fair trade always gives access to small producers. This is an extremely powerful model for ongoing reform of the system, is giving that access. This provides a chance for very powerful, transformative change over a long period of time. If fair trade groups continue to work with small farmer co-ops over the decades, there's a very high probability that substantial systemic change will take place. As divergence between these fair trade groups has occurred, corporations that work with plantations and hired laborers have turned away from structural change that is co-defined by cooperatives in the South.
Women and men who do not own and run cooperative businesses, those women and men who work on plantations, are actually hired laborers. In this case, the vast majority of economic benefits of the hired laborers' work still goes to plantation owners and corporate processors and distributors, even though farmers earn decent wages during the growing season that sustain families at a basic level. Corporations that work with plantations do not have to work with the same hired laborers year after year. This redefinition of fair trade by most corporations and certifiers means that control of fair trade is being taken away from the people in the South who helped invent the solution to their historical lack of democratic power and productive control.
Absolutely. Conclusions for university and popular education. A well-defined self and group education process about fair trade in universities, NGOs, nonprofits, cooperatives, and other organizations and networks would contribute to a clearer understanding of where these fair trade clusters could be headed in the long run, and how fair trade energies could be most effectively targeted to eliminate poverty, hunger, and economic disenfranchisement that comes with formal and informal colonialism. We see the promotion of an understanding of history and long-term change as a useful way to build ecological health and feminism into all fair trade applications, advancing fair trade's long-term promise. Universities and other research and educational organizations, such as fair trade groups, can prepare learners to think critically and act effectively for structural change.
They can do this by addressing colonialism and reversing its processes, including by finding more ways to return and reclaim economic, political, and cultural power for the Global South.
By thinking about a variety of democratic alternatives to a volume-oriented, profit-driven, short-term economic model.
They can do it by participating in a variety of long-term structural social change projects.
And by building gender and racial and global equality into all new social relations from the very beginning.
And by building in ecological sustainability and the restoration of the civil commons right from the start, too.
And by always asking questions.